Well, good Wednesday to you. It's Rodney here again. So glad I could be with you today. So glad you're joining me and watching this class study together. We're moving through the study of the end of time and dealing with some very specific events that are at least taught as being associated with the end of time. And some of those are maybe falsely taught. Some of those are maybe falsely understood. Some of those are maybe a misinterpretation of some of the scriptures. Some of those are very accurate and very applicable and things that we need to address and deal with. Before we get there, for our study tonight, I just want to let you know, as far as I know, things are pretty well on the home front here at Leoma. I hope they are where you are. Of course, we have some families that are affected by the virus that are coming off of some days of quarantine. And as far as I know, the symptoms are getting better. If there's somebody out there that's really struggling with the virus, I'm not aware. I would love to be, but I'm not. If that's the case, I hope it's not. But I do know that we have some extended family, if you will, that are being affected very heavily, and one that's even lost a loved one to the virus. And so, anyway, a lot of people to keep in our prayers and in our thoughts. A lot of people, obviously, the virus is still very real and still spreading around us. And so, every reason to keep ourselves safe and secure and to try to take the precautions that we can. I hope things are okay where you are, and I hope you're good and well. And if you're not, certainly pray for you and for your situation. And it may not be virus related at all. And one of our announcers said last week that we live in a world today where you can't just be sick. If you're not feeling well, then you must have the virus. And so it's a very true statement. And oftentimes we have lost sight of the fact in this whole deal that we still have people who are just sick. It doesn't have anything to do with the virus, and we have people who are losing loved ones that has nothing to do with the virus. And so, with all that being said, we're certainly mindful and praying for you. Last week we looked at the rapture. We looked at some ideas behind the rapture, some beliefs behind the rapture. This week we want to go to, really it's too much for one and maybe not enough for two lessons. So I just put it into part one and part two, and you'll get maybe two shorter ones. And my daddy always said, son, you'll never get fired for a short sermon. And so with that mentality and ideology, I'll give you two shorter lessons perhaps on the millennium. What is it about the millennium? What is being taught? What is the thoughts? What is the interpretation behind it? Where does this idea even come from? Should there be a literal 1,000 years? Where should it go? Where does it fit? At what point does Christ come back in it? All of those questions. Is it physical? Is it spiritual? What's Israel's role in it? In Revelation 20, and I just want to read this passage in Revelation 20, beginning in verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hands the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil, Satan. He bound him for 1,000 years, and he threw him into a pit, shut it, sealed it, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that he must be released for a little while. Verse 4, Then I saw thrones, John says, and seated on those were the authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus, for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life, reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. But they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. Verse 7, Revelation 20. And when the 1,000 years were ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out and deceive the nations that are on the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea, and they marched over the broad plain of the earth, surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophets were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. The first 10 verses of the 20th chapter of the book of Revelation. If you remove those 10 verses, you nowhere else in Scripture have the mention or the idea of 1,000 years. But some 6 times in these 10 verses, we find the mentioning of the 1,000 years. Now, it's interesting to me that only in Revelation 20 do you find that. And yet we have documents, books, ideologies, theologies, eschatology chapters on this 1,000 years reign, this millennium. Basically, you have 4 prominent views of the millennium. You have 2 prominent views within the idea of premillennialism, one idea within the thought of postmillennialism, and then you have amillennialism. So 4. We're going to talk about postmillennial, classic or traditional premillennial, dispensational premillennial, and amillennial. So let's start with postmillennial, if you will. The idea of postmillennialism was made very popular in the 19th and 20th century. So you would say, well, that's a fairly new or recent development. But it comes from some ideas from way back. And popular to this idea would be guys like Alexander Campbell and B.B. Warfield. But what happened is that in the 20th century, you had the 2 world wars. And they really didn't line up with the idea of postmillennialism. Now, postmillennialism would say that we're in the tribulation now, that we're in the 1,000-year reign now. Post meaning Christ is going to come back, the second coming after post the 1,000 years. And so we're in that time now. Satan is bound now. Postmillennial would say that the world is getting better and better, that Christians are converting more and more Christians, and as a result, the nations are being Christianized. And so the kingdom is growing. It's slow, but it's steady. This is a very optimistic way of viewing the 1,000-year reign. It sounds very good, but as I mentioned, there are things that really caused a hit to the postmillennial mindset, namely World War II, because the world wasn't getting better. And so this idea in the last few verses of Revelation 20, where Satan is released and evil is, well, that's going to happen right at the very end, and then Christ is going to come back, and he's going to win, and all of these Christian nations are going to surround the king, the ruler, and reign with him. Some objections to this view. Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, Jesus says, enter at the straight gate, or enter at the narrow gate. Why? Because wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many there be. You see, Jesus doesn't paint a picture of most people being Christians. He actually paints the opposite picture in Matthew 7. And so, postmillennial would say that the majority of people are Christianized, but the Bible would say right the opposite. There are few, because the road is narrow and the gate is small or difficult that leads to life, and there are few. Matthew 7 and verse 14. Or how about 1 Timothy 4, when Paul writes to Timothy and he describes the latter days. Now, the Spirit expressingly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrine of demons, speaking lies of hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and condemning to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving. Those who believe and know the truth. It sounds like that Paul is describing to Timothy a time when the world will actually be getting worse, not better. That Christianity will actually be the minority, not the majority. The idea of it evil abounding and spreading. And that's right, the opposite. The postmillennial thought of the fact that the world's getting better and it's very optimistic is great. It just doesn't line up with Scripture. And then just the whole idea of thinking about having 1,000 years, it just takes away the urgency or the desire of God for us to be ready at all times. Like in Matthew 24, and that whole idea of stay awake and be alert and be on guard and you don't know the hour. And so if the kingdom established and we're counting down, but now most postmillennials would not hold it to a literal 1,000-year reign. And so they would suggest that, well, we don't know the timing and we don't know when. And so we got to be ready. And so we have some time, okay, but we don't know how much time. And so, but again, the objections are still very clear. And so this view has really kind of died. You've probably not heard of postmillennialism, very, very little, if any at all, in recent years, because what we're having to admit is that the world is not getting better, that righteousness is not abounding more and more. And so then we flip the switch to premillennial. Well, when I first got introduced to this, it was just premillennialism. And it was probably the classical, traditional, historical view of premillennial. So I'll start there. And basically, this view says that Christ is going to come prior to, so pre the 1,000 years. So Christ is going to come, and then there's going to be 1,000-year reign, and then ultimately the final second coming, the advent of Christ there. The kingdom will be established, and there'll be this 1,000 years. Now, this view became very popular in the 2nd, 3rd centuries. Guys like Irenaeus, Tertullian, those guys fostered this, Justin Martyr. And basically they say, okay, for the 1,000 years, the world is going to get worse and worse, and the saints are going to be reigning with Jesus, and then Jerusalem's going to be the headquarters, and so Israel's going to be important. Jesus is going to fulfill the prophecy there. Satan's going to be loosed. The battle's going to begin. Satan's going to lose the battle. The bodies are all going to be resurrected at the end of the 1,000 years. And so you have this 1,000-year period that's going to culminate with all of these events, and it's going to be a literal 1,000 years that is going to begin when Jesus first appears or comes back to earth. This would require, some objections to this view would require that Revelation 19 is immediately before Revelation 20. And so what we've got to assume is that the book of Revelation is in order. Well, the book of Matthew ain't in order. The book of Mark ain't in order. Why would the book of Revelation be in order? Why would the book of Revelation be chronological when there are books that are much easier written to understand that are not chronological? And so it concerns me that we would say, well, the victory and the judgment scene in Revelation 19 would then the 1,000 years immediately follows that. And so Jesus appears on his horse and the judgment scene of chapter 19, and then 1,000 years follows that before the ultimate second coming and the final coming of Jesus at the end of the 1,000-year reign. But that's what they got to have. They've got to have Revelation, the book of Revelation, in order. They've also got to have 2 resurrections. And if you were with me 2 weeks ago now, when we started talking about the resurrection of the dead, there's just not 2 resurrections spoken of. And there's certainly not a 1,000-year period in between the resurrections, if there were. Some have suggested there are as many as 4 resurrections, but that'll be the dispensational people that we're about to get into. I understand Revelation 20 speaks of a first resurrection, but why does that automatically imply a second resurrection, some would ask? And John 5 and Acts 24 would speak of the resurrection of the righteous and the resurrection of the wicked together. One resurrection, sudden. Now they may be going to 2 different places, fair enough, like we talked about in the rapture even last week. But the resurrection occurs once upon a time, sudden, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. I don't find a time. The Bible speaks of the age now and the age to come. The Bible doesn't speak of an age in between, and 1,000-year period would have to be an age. And the Bible just doesn't speak of that. It speaks of the world having ended. And when the world having ended, so this idea of classical or traditional premillennialism, but then you come to dispensational millennialism because they didn't think that the idea of premillennialism was complicated enough. So they come in, and if I could show you this on a chart, you got the church age, you've got the rapture, they're the ones that's got the secret rapture. Now a lot of people who hold to premillennialism today, guys like D.L. Moody, Scofield's Reference Bible made this very popular, came out in 1909, sold over 2,000 copies since then. And in Scofield's theology, dispensational premillennialism became very popular. Guys like Hal Lindsey, that we talked about last week with the rapture and all, and I mentioned dispensational premillennialism, but basically they see dispensations of time, as many as 7 of them. And so then you break down the first coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ, the end of time. You've got the tribulation in here. You've got the reign of the Antichrist. You've got the binding of Satan. You've got all of this happening. Then you've got the millennium, the 1,000 years. You've got a couple of resurrections occurring before that. You've got the Battle of Armageddon. You've got the loosing of Satan, and then evil abounding. Then you've got another resurrection. Then you've got the judgment coming and a resurrection. It's just very complicated. And in order to have all of this, you've got the establishment of the kingdom of God in Jerusalem, in Israel. You've got it being physical in nature. And there's just so many objections. The dispensational premillennialists don't even agree altogether. So now they have what they call a classical dispensational, a neo-dispensational, and a moderate dispensational. So they have 3 branches even within their branch of premillennialism. And if your brain is not hurting enough now, do I need to go further? The point is, it gets very complicated, and the reality of it is that man has made it complicated, and it really all comes out of Revelation 20, to be quite honest, and the going back to the prophecies of the book of Daniel, and how do we understand the prophecies in the literal 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days, and the 7 years of tribulation, 3.5 years on one side, 3.5 years on the other side, and where the Antichrist and where the binding of Satan and all of that fits in. The problem is that the Bible never speaks literally of a rapture. And it certainly doesn't give a secret rapture as they would want. It doesn't speak of Israel being physical. It doesn't speak of the earth being involved here. They get into this whole new heavens and new earth. And so this idea of reigning on earth or reigning in heaven, and Jesus is going to reign in heaven for a while, and then he's going to come back after the tribulation. He's going to reign on earth for a while, and all the saints are going to be taken to Jerusalem, to Israel, to the physical, geographical location. And the Bible speaks of Israel as being spiritual now. Physical in the Old Testament, fine, but spiritual now. It's not a physical Israel. And ultimately, the biggest challenge with this whole dispensational premillennialism is that it gives no value to the modern age of the church. The church has no value because we're waiting on. Now, you can say, well, you need to get righteous in order to be in the secret rapture. And fine, fair enough, and I hope I'm in that group. But if I'm not in that group, then I'm still going to be okay because I've got a second chance, a third chance, and I'll get all this figured out. And to be quite honest with you, it requires no faith because I can wait till it starts unfolding. Then I've got time. And I can get it all figured out then. And so several objections come with this view and just the complexity of it. And then you come to the fourth view, and I'll leave you with this one for tonight and let you wrestle with these four views. And that is amillennialism. And obviously when you put the A out there, it means the negative, no millennial. And I'm not sure that that's exactly what they mean. Can there be a millennium? Sure. Can there be it's probably not literal, but is there a figurative reference of time of 1,000 years? Is it a long period of time? Sure. Is there a loosening of Satan for a short period of time in contrast to a long period of time? Sure. We're not denying that. Amillennialists are not denying that. We're not trying to take Revelation 20 out of the Bible. It's just simply an understanding of what is physical, what is literal, what is spiritual. The kingdom is spiritual in nature. It was established at the first coming of Jesus, his death on the cross, his ascension back to heaven. We are in the present age now, and this is part of the tribulation, part of the binding and loosening of Satan, part of the spread of evil, and it's all going to culminate in the return of Christ, the second coming, when the resurrection will occur. Yes, when people will be caught up and raptured. Okay, fine. When Satan has had his greatest work and God determines to put an end to Satan, sure, all of that is going to occur. And the end of time becomes very much simplified. Satan on earth appears to be winning. Jesus returns. Satan loses. Righteousness wins. Righteous people are exalted. Christ is victorious. He takes his kingdom to heaven, the spiritual heaven, to dwell and exist and to reign eternally. And he sends Satan and those unrighteous to the pit, to the abyss, to the lake of fire, to the never-ending, never-quenching, eternal place of punishment. And if you want to say that we're living in a millennium now, that's fine. And if you want to say that the tribulation is going on now, that's fine. But don't overcomplicate. You see, it's interesting to me, there's a rule in text criticism that when we're looking at manuscripts that differ from the text of the Bible, what is number one common rule, unless something causes you to go a different direction, you go with the simplest, less complicated, glossy manuscript. And the reason why is because the complicated, glossy, well-manicured is very likely the case that man has come along and put his spin on it and tried to complicate it. And so in text criticism, we go back to the simplest. Obviously, we're trying to get the oldest manuscript, which most likely is the most simple. And so let's use that idea with this whole idea of millennialism. Why do we want to adopt the most complicated, glossy, over-analyzed, if it's right, it's right. But in reality, what I do believe personally is that if you want the literal 1,000 years, I don't think you should, but then you've got to go ahead and let it be started. And then you've got to admit that if it started at the establishment of the kingdom, then we've been longer than 1,000 years. So that tears down the literalness of it. And whatever you do, don't make this physical. This is all spiritual. The Battle of Armageddon, spiritual. The rapture, whatever, the calling up of is spiritual. The second coming of Christ, spiritual. The kingdom, spiritual. The reign, spiritual. The place where it exists, spiritual. Not physical. And so don't ever adopt a system by which the emphasis would be on the physical earth or the physical Israel or the physical Jerusalem. Amillennialism, okay, very popular in the 4th and 5th centuries with guys like Augustine, guys like William Hendrickson, who I do a lot of word study with today and use his material, is an amillennialist, among others. The point is there are different views out there. And it may help, and Lord willing, next week we'll dive off deeper into Revelation 20. And I want you to see Revelation 20, and I want you to understand Revelation 20, and I want you to be scared of it. But tonight I just wanted to give you the background of all of this discussion and what the views are that are out there. And so with that, I leave you to meditation, to pondering, to further study, if you so desire, upon the topic of millennialism as it exists in our world today. Certainly, we have a lot of premillennialists in our world today. And you need to know how to discuss and to accurately defend the Bible with those people specifically. Hope you have a great Wednesday. Hope you have a great weekend. If you're able to join us Sunday morning, love to have you at 10 o'clock. And obviously, we're still meeting at 7 o'clock on Wednesday night. Until next Wednesday, have a great day. Take care.